Hi, I'm Jenny Sykes, and you are listening to ADA Live.
Yo. All right, let's roll. Let's go.
Hi, everybody. On behalf of the Southeast ADA Center, the Burton Blatt Institute at Syracuse University, and the ADA National Network, I want to welcome you to ADA Live. I'm Barry Whaley. I'm the director of the Southeast ADA Center. Listening audience, if you have questions about the Americans with Disabilities Act, you can use our online form anytime at adalive.org, or you can call the Southeast ADA Center at 404-541-9001. Those calls are free and they're confidential. So in this episode, we talk about some of the most common questions we received in the past year at the Southeast ADA Center from people with disabilities. In all, we've received over 1,600 TA questions so far this year, and as a team, we focus on each request for information and send specific resources for those individuals. Couldn't think of anybody better to talk about the work of the TA Center than our own lead technical information specialist, Jenny Sykes. So Jenny, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Barry. It's a pleasure to be here.
So Jenny, before we can talk about the protections, I think it's important that we define what a disability is under the ADA. Could you give us that definition?
Sure. Let's start with the ADA is the Americans with Disabilities Act. And when most people hear the word disability, they think of a medical diagnosis, such as blindness, hearing loss, or mobility challenges. However, under the ADA, disability is a legal term, not a medical one. The ADA defines a person with a disability as someone who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities. Major life activities include things like seeing, hearing, communicating, walking, learning, thinking, and also bodily functions such as digestion and immune response. The ADA also protects individuals who have a record of impairment. For example, someone who previously had cancer but is now in remission is still protected under the ADA. And the ADA also applies to individuals who are regarded as having a disability and experience discrimination because of that. And the definition of disability under the ADA is broad on purpose. It's meant to ensure that individuals with impairments that substantially limit major life activities have equal opportunities to participate in public life.
Great. Thanks, Jenny. So just to reiterate, you have to have a impairment that substantially impacts a major life activity. And that's a broad interpretation of what that is. You could also have protection because you have a history of having a disability, or you might be regarded as having a disability and receive protection. Does that sound correct to you?
Absolutely.
Now, the ADA isn't the only law that protects people with disabilities, right?
And actually, that does surprise a lot of people. The ADA is the cornerstone of disability rights, but it's part of a much larger legal framework that protects people with disabilities in different areas of life. Let me give you some examples of the laws. So we have the Rehabilitation Act, and that came before the ADA and set the stage for future legislation. The Rehabilitation Act prohibits discrimination against individuals with disabilities, and it applies to federal entities and to programs and services that receive federal funding. And then we have the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA, which was enacted to provide equal educational opportunities for students with disabilities. And this is the foundation for things like an individualized education program, or an IEP. There's the Architectural Barriers Act, or ABA, and this is about the built environment and making sure that federally funded buildings and facilities are accessible. And the Fair Housing Act protects people from discrimination in housing. It also allows individuals with disabilities to request reasonable accommodations and modifications as needed so they can have full access to their homes and amenities. And the Air Carrier Access Act. Many people think that the ADA covers airlines, but actually it's the Air Carrier Access Act that applies to airlines, and the ADA applies to airports. And it's important to know that part of the Air Carrier Access Act includes the requirement to provide documentation prior to air travel if you're going to be traveling with a service animal. And if anyone has questions about that, they're welcome to contact us. And then right now, given the season we're in, the Voting Accessibility Act is very important. And this law was enacted to specify requirements regarding the accessibility of the voting process and voting facilities. So in general, when people ask me about disability and accessibility, I think of protections under the overall legislation, not just the ADA.
That's a good point. Yep. Thank you, Jenny. Let's turn our attention to Airbnbs for a minute. They become very popular, these short-term rentals. Do they have to comply with the ADA?
That's actually a very interesting question, and we do get that question a lot. It's somewhat of a gray area because it depends on the nature of the short-term rental. So the general rule is that a short-term rental is considered a public accommodation under Title III of the ADA if it operates like a business. So this could be the case if it offers services like cleaning or linen changes, if it uses third-party booking services and platforms, if it doesn't assign a specific unit until check-in, or if it doesn't require a lease or security deposit. However, if it's a private owner renting their own home occasionally without those commercial features, it might not fall under the ADA, but it could fall under state or local zoning requirements, so you would want to consult with that. For example, if someone owns 3 beach houses that they rent year-round through an online platform with professional cleaning staff, that's a commercial enterprise. They need to consider ADA requirements like accessible entrances and bathrooms and allowing service animals. On the other hand, if a family rents their home for a week once a year and they're not using any of those commercial features, then the ADA probably doesn't apply. And again, please remember, this is an evolving area of law, so you do want to check local zoning ordinances that may be in play.
Let's turn our attention to service animals. What are the requirements the ADA has regarding service animals and handlers?
Okay, well, that one is a very hot topic question. So under the ADA Title II, which applies to public entities, and Title III, which applies to businesses, a service animal is defined as a dog that's individually trained to do work or perform tasks for a person with a disability. So this could include things like guiding someone who is blind, alerting someone who is deaf, pulling a wheelchair, assisting during a seizure, reminding someone to take medication, or calming someone with PTSD during an anxiety attack. So when a person with a service animal arrives at a business or, say, a government building, staff there can ask 2 questions of the person. Is the dog required because of a disability? And what work or task has the dog been trained to perform? They cannot ask for a service animal certificate or registration because those things are not required by law. And nor is a service animal required to wear a vest. Unfortunately, there are online businesses selling vests and certificates that have no basis in law, and this is confusing the situation for individuals with legitimate service animals. So one requirement for a service animal is that it must be under control of the handler at all times. The handler can do this with a leash, harness, or voice control. And if the service animal is out of control, or say it relieves itself in an inappropriate location, a business can ask the handler to remove the animal. They need to allow the individual to return without the animal, and they cannot ban the service animal permanently. It's important for businesses and government entities to train staff to understand the ADA requirements regarding service animals. And if you want to learn more about service animals, we have a great deal of information on our website, and individuals can call us anytime with questions.
Thanks, Jenny, for all this great information. ADA Live listening audience, if you have questions about this topic or any other ADA Live topic, you can submit those questions online at adalive.org, or you can call the Southeast ADA Center, 404-541-9001. And now we're going to pause for a word from our sponsor, the ADA National Network.
The ADA National Network provides information, guidance, and training on the Americans with Disabilities Act tailored to meet the needs of business, government, and individuals at local, regional, and national levels. The ADA National Network consists of 10 regional ADA centers in the United States, providing local assistance to ensure that the ADA is implemented wherever possible. The ADA National Network is not an enforcement agency, but a helpful resource supporting the ADA's mission to make it possible for everyone with a disability to live a life of freedom and equality.
Welcome back. We're talking with our lead TA expert, Jenny Sykes. We've been talking about service animals and fair housing. We've touched on a lot of topics. Let's stick with service animal for a moment, Jenny. What's the difference between a service animal and, say, an emotional support animal?
Well, that's another question we get a lot on the technical assistance team, and it's a big point of confusion, especially for housing providers and businesses. The use of a service animal is protected under the ADA. They're trained to perform specific tasks related to someone's disability. An emotional support animal, or ESA, is not covered by the Americans with Disabilities Act. ESAs are protected under the Fair Housing Act, which means that landlords or housing providers may have to make accommodations to allow them, but stores, restaurants, and other public places don't have to allow emotional service animals. For example, if someone has a dog that's trained to alert them before they have a seizure, that's a service dog. It's covered under the ADA, and it can go into businesses. If someone has a cat that provides comfort during depression or anxiety, but isn't trained for specific tasks, that's an emotional support animal. An emotional support animal may live with their owner in housing, but they can't be taken into public places that don't allow pets. So that's the primary difference between an emotional support animal and a service animal.
Thanks, Jenny. Yeah, that helps clear up some things, doesn't it? Jenny, does the general public have any rights? For instance, what happens if a customer has a service animal and, let's say, a clerk is allergic to the dog?
We've actually had that question a number of times, and it's a great example of the ADA's core principle, which is to provide equal access to everyone involved in a situation, or to the best degree possible. So the business can't deny service to the person with the service animal because an employee has allergies. Instead, the business management should try and find a solution. This could include having another employee to assist the customer who comes in with the service animal, or perhaps rearranging the store space so that the employee with allergies and a service animal wouldn't have to be right next to each other. So it's really about reasonable accommodation on both sides and not excluding anyone. And situations like that one give businesses the opportunity to demonstrate respect and creativity and not create conflict. And when they communicate with each other, individuals with disabilities and businesses, there's usually a way to find a solution that meets everybody's needs.
Very good. Thank you, Jenny. Jenny, let's turn our attention to the Employment Protections Title I. How do I ask my employer for a reasonable accommodation?
Okay, under the ADA, you can ask for a reasonable accommodation verbally or in writing. And it can be as simple as saying, I need an adjustment to my workspace because of a medical condition. You don't even have to mention the ADA by name. You just need to make it clear that you are requesting help related to a medical condition or disability. Now, there is one thing that is usually recommended, even though it's not required. And that's to put a request in writing because it creates a record of when and how the request was made. Then after the request is made, if the disability and need for accommodation are not obvious, an employer may ask for limited medical documentation. They may not ask for a full medical file or treatment plans. They can only ask for enough to confirm the disability and the need for the accommodation. And accommodations might include things like a flexible schedule, ergonomic equipment, remote work, assistive technology devices, or modified duties. And that's just a few examples. Employers and employees are required to talk to each other and negotiate potential accommodations. This is called the interactive process. And the ideal result of the interactive process is that a solution is arrived at that will work well for both parties. So again, we answer a lot of questions about the accommodation process, and we refer callers to a variety of materials and training videos on this topic. There are a lot of great tools out there to use if a person is intimidated about making the accommodation request. And remember, folks can always call us and ask questions about the accommodation process.
Yeah, very, very true, Jenny. Thank you. Jenny, there's some confusion perhaps you could clear up. What's the difference between an accommodation and a modification?
That's a really good question, Barry. And actually, that was one that I had trouble with when I first started in this field. So one way to remember it is that in employment, which is Title I, we say an accommodation when some type of assistance is being provided for an employee or applicant with disabilities. In public or government programs, which are under Title II and Title III of the ADA, assistance is referred to as a modification of policy, practice, or procedure. So for example, if you're an employee asking for a new chair due to your disability, that's an accommodation. If you're a customer asking restaurant staff to read a menu aloud because you can't see, that's a modification of their policy or procedure. Things get a little complicated because the terms are kind of flipped in housing. In housing, an accommodation means a change in policy. For example, allowing an assistance animal in a no pets building. A modification means a physical change like installing a ramp or lowering countertops. So it's really about the context.
That's interesting, Jenny. So do all businesses have to be accessible or some exempt?
Well, bottom line is if the business serves the public, it's almost always going to be required to be accessible. And under Title III, the ADA covers public accommodations, which includes restaurants, hotels, retail shops, movie theaters, schools, doctor's offices, and much more. And accessibility isn't just about wheelchair ramps. Folks need to remember that it includes accessible parking, accessible entrances and exits, accessible bathrooms, accessible counter heights, accessible websites, having clear wayfinding signage. So small businesses sometimes think the ADA only applies to big corporations, but that's not true. The ADA applies to small businesses as well, and there are even tax incentives for small businesses to make accessibility improvements. For example, the disabled access credit can be used more than once to make a business more accessible over time. It's important to remember that things that benefit individuals with disabilities often benefit everyone. For example, automatic doors help parents pushing strollers, delivery workers with heavy boxes, older adults, and others. That's an example of universal design, and that's the spirit of the ADA.
Very true. Thank you, Jenny. So what about those buildings that can't be made accessible? Would I have to close my business?
No, the ADA never intended for businesses to have to go out of business. They intended for businesses to be as accessible as possible, and they recognize that there can be constraints. So, for example, the ADA recognizes something called technical infeasibility. It means that if making a change would literally require removing, say, a load-bearing wall, which is structurally impossible, then you're only going to be required to do what's technically feasible. However, a business is still responsible to provide access to the maximum extent they can, even given the constraints. So that might mean offering curbside pickup to a business that doesn't have an accessible entrance, or providing virtual appointments, or relocating some services to areas that are accessible. So the main point is that accessibility is about intention, not perfection. The law expects a good faith effort from a business. Thinking that you can't do everything to make a business accessible isn't the excuse to do nothing. It's a good idea to be creative and get feedback from your customers with disabilities, and remember the tax incentives, they may be helpful.
Yeah, very good, Jenny. And I like that intention, not perfection. That's good.
Yeah.
As we've discussed, the technical issues that we have started seeing at all of the regional ADA centers, they become far more complex. I was wondering if you could give us an example of a recent complex technical assistance call you researched.
Sure. Actually, I could probably give you a number of them, but some of them are really involved. So I'm going to focus on one that I thought was really interesting. This one was interesting because we usually get calls from business owners who don't want to allow service animals. This time, a man called us who owns a small restaurant. He has a customer who comes in regularly with a small dog. The owner doesn't think the dog is a service animal, but he hasn't asked any questions because the dog hasn't bothered anyone. The restaurant owner lets the dog sit on the chair or the booth next to the customer. Recently, another customer complained to the owner. They said that the dog should not be permitted to sit next to the handler on the chair or booth, and it should be on the floor. The person complaining told the owner that it's unsanitary and the ADA doesn't allow it. So the owner did some research and read the Department of Justice frequently asked questions about service animals document, and it includes a question about restaurant seating. The DOJ document says, seating, food, and drink are provided for customer use only. The ADA gives a person with a disability the right to be accompanied by his or her service animal, but covered entities are not required to allow an animal to sit or be fed at the table. So that's what the DOJ has to say. So the restaurant owner wanted to know if the answer meant he had the option of letting the man's animal be seated at the table. So the first thing we did was we talked about requirements related to a service animal and the importance of determining if the animal is a service animal. Then we talked about the DOJ answer and how it wasn't really intended to be optional. Most states have health codes where they don't allow pets in restaurants, for example. And it was still unclear in this example if the customer's dog is a service animal because the owner had never asked the questions. So we talked about the possibility of the restaurant owner creating a clear policy about pets versus service animals. Then he could talk to the man with the dog and determine if it is a service animal. And if it is, he could request that the man have the dog lay on the floor and explain that he's just following what the DOJ requires. And that way the customer ideally is happy and the business owner no longer has to be concerned with complaints from other patrons. So I thought that one was very interesting.
That is very interesting. Thanks, Jenny. Jenny, thanks again for being with us today to share this important information. Listeners, I want to thank you for joining us. You can access all ADA Live episodes with archived audio, accessible transcripts, and resources on our website at adalive.org. You can listen to ADA Live on the SoundCloud channel. Look for soundcloud.com/ADA Live. You can also download ADA Live to your mobile device. Go to your podcast app and search for ADA Live. If you have questions about the Americans with Disabilities Act, you can use our online form anytime at adalive.org, or you can contact your regional ADA center at 800-949-3233. 800-949-4232. Again, that's 800-949-4232. Those calls are always free and confidential. ADA Live is a program of the Southeast ADA Center, the Burton Blatt Institute at Syracuse University, and a collaboration with the Disability Employment Policy Rehabilitation Research and Training Center. Our producer is Celestia Razda with me. I'm Barry Whaley, Mary Mortar, Marcia Schwanke, Chase Coleman, Stacy Kernison. Our music is from Four Wheel City, the Movement for Improvement. We also invite you to tune in to our companion podcast, Disability Rights Today, for in-depth discussion on important court cases that shape disability rights in the Americans with Disabilities Act. You can learn more at disabilityrightstoday.org. We'll see you next episode.
Helicopters over us. They watching. They don't want us to be a part of their city, man. They pull all these steps, man. All these curves,